Yes. Because
Yes,
again, unfortunately, you were right, and I was not. So just to add this point.
If it makes you feel any better, I desperately wish that I was wrong about all of these things, because as we can see, there's a global crisis taking shape that's going to affect every single one of us, you and I, our families, our friends, our communities, and no matter who is watching this, almost certainly they will begin feeling the effects of all of this as well. Now, unfortunately, I was right, and I warned people months before the 2024 election that it didn't matter who was elected, because it is all about the structural nature of the US system. It is controlled by large corporate financier interests. They are predicated on the constant expansion of profit and power. That is what they do in terms of a business, and that is what they do in terms of a nation-state system that they have captured and control, and have done so for decades and decades. And I constantly refer back to the policy papers, which wrote this out in excruciating detail years and years ago, especially this conflict taking place against Iran right now. I always refer to the Which Path to Persia Brookings Institution paper from 2009. And chapter by chapter, word for word, the United States, from the Bush Jr. administration all the way up to this current Trump administration, they have executed every single option that they laid out. And it wasn't about any single one option being used and succeeding against Iran. They always assumed that they would have to be used in conjunction with one another, creating synergies between them, and weakening, hollowing out, and then toppling Iran in the same way that the US has done to other countries. Syria at the end of the Biden administration, which, by the way, deliberately set the stage for this current war taking place under the Trump administration. I warned the moment Syria collapsed and the US and Israel were taking out Syria's integrated air defense systems that they were clearing an air corridor that was called for by that Brookings paper all the way back in 2009. They were obsessed with clearing out air corridors so that they could strike Iran directly. And as soon as they did that, you saw first Israel strike at the consulate in Damascus. That was kind of a test run. And then there was a missile exchange there. And then in 2025, that is when this all began. And again, the same policy paper, all the way back in 2009, talked about using Israel as a means of provoking this war, getting it started in the first place, doing all of these things to prepare for it, and then using Israel as a means of triggering it to both absorb most of the retaliation and the blame for the conflict. Again, I just want to impress upon people that was all the way back in 2009, and you can see the current Trump administration, Trump supporters, the Western media doing this exact technique that was laid out in this policy paper. President Trump blaming Israel for striking the energy production sites in Iran. This was obviously a joint US-Israeli operation, but they're blaming Israel just as the policy papers laid out. So understanding the structural material reality of how the United States operates as a nation state, or as a captured state of corporate financier interests, will give you infinite insight into what it's doing and why. And essentially, it is a giant geopolitical virus expanding for profit and power, which is why it could never, ever accept a multipolar world, because then it would mean constraining its constant need to expand power and profit, which is just fundamentally against its nature and an impossibility as long as the interests running the US right now continue running the US. So unfortunately, this was all inevitable. That's why people could just go back to my videos actually years ago warning about all of this. And that's why it has unfolded in the way that it has, not because I'm able to predict the future, but because the corporations run US foreign and domestic policy. They come to a consensus using these policy papers. The policy papers are taken by lawyers and turned into bills, but also strategists and turned into war plans in the Pentagon and in Washington. And then the corporate media sells this policy to the public and tries to convince them corporate interests are also American interests. And this is why it never ends, no matter who you vote for, because ultimately all of these politicians, they got into power in the first place through huge lobbying money and campaign donations, mostly coming from large corporations and entire blocks of industries.
Yeah, this is well, I guess it's important to see this in the wider context, because geopolitics, as you know, is how geography impacts politics. In geopolitics, the main focus has always been Eurasia since at least Macintosh's days, and there always been the focus then on these three main powers, on the Russians, the Chinese, and the South, of course, the Iranians. And it does appear we entered a new game, because as you just said, they always look for some synergies. If you weaken one, push them apart, yeah. So you can see in the war planning that there is an efforts to see all of this combined. And in this new great game, however, we see that there's something very different than what you saw in the 19th or the 20th century, which is the desperation, though, the risk taking, the willingness to engage even in self-harm. the willingness to throw away all rules, essentially embrace complete anarchy, as we see now with the energy markets and the preparedness to destroy the global economy. This is something new, though, it feels. But do you see this? Um, did you see the attempt to destroy Iran as also then being an effort to, like, another stepping stone to go after China, Russia, similar as you said, it was quite predictable when Iran was taken down that the Syria was taken down, that Iran would be next. I mean, you said you only need to predict the future. You can read the documents from the think tanks and all these intelligence agencies, which essentially run some of them, but also people like General Wesley Clark, who kind of outlined exactly the scenario when he outlined the 7 countries to take out, with Iran being the grand finale. So it's hardly a secret anymore that how it's set up. But do you see Iran then being a stepping stone towards the Chinese or the Russians, or both?
Both. And as a matter of fact, if you look all the way back to 2011 and the so-called Arab Spring, which was actually engineered by the US years in advance, and there's documented evidence proving all of this. The whole point of the Arab Spring was to reconfigure the Arab world into a united front against Iran, to encircle, contain, and then collapse Iran. And then the goal always was, and if people think back to 2011, people like John McCain and probably Lindsey Graham and that circle of people, they all openly, publicly, and repeatedly said the Arab Spring is taking down the Arab world today. It's going after Iran tomorrow, and the final destination is Moscow and Beijing. They were very open about this. And you can see from then until now, the very deliberate, coordinated steps taken, spanning administrations, Republican or Democratic, did not matter. And they did it step by step by step, tangling Russia up in Ukraine. Again, going to the Rand Corporation paper from 2019, extending Russia. That was all about weakening and tying up Russia. And if you look in that paper, they talk about targeting everything that we now see them targeting: Russian energy exports, Russian energy production, tying them up in a proxy war inside of Ukraine, causing trouble all along their periphery. But they also put in options in there like sending more weapons to Syria, because Russia was desperately trying to stabilize Syria. And then we can see that eventually all of these put together on Russia weakened and distracted Russia. They were forced to make a decision. They decided Ukraine was the priority. Syria collapsed. But as you can see, Syria was in itself a stepping stone towards encircling, containing, and launching war against Iran. And of course, all of this is aimed at China. The United States knows that China is on the rise, that it probably has a 5 to 10 years at absolute most likely somewhere around 5 years. China will irreversibly surpass the United States in ways that will make it impossible for the United States to ever try to slow down or stop its rise. In particular, in terms of energy independence, China, if people look at what China has been doing over the last several years, in addition to the Belt and Road Initiative to create land routes to circumvent potential maritime oil blockades, which China has always been aware of and preparing for, they themselves domestically have been ramping up coal to liquid industrial processes to take coal and turn it into an alternative for the fuel they're still importing from the Middle East. They have been building these pipelines with Russia, importing huge amounts of energy into China from Russia, and they plan on bringing in even more. There's been a rush for nuclear power and, of course, solar and other renewable power. This is by far the largest adopter of all of these sources of energy than anyone else on Earth. Nuclear, renewables, doesn't matter. China is in the lead by far. And that is because they are trying to achieve energy independence. And it was probably around 2030 they would have achieved that. And so the United States had a very tiny closing window of opportunity to try to disrupt China before they made that final transition. This is why they've struck at Iran, and you can see what has happened. Not only did they attack Iran, but before that, they invaded, kidnapped the president of Venezuela, and is now holding hostage the remaining Venezuelan government. They've stopped energy from flowing from Venezuela to China. They are, as the New York Times has reported, and as was always obvious all along, the CIA is behind these long-range drone strikes deep into Russian territory, striking Russian energy production. And the CIA is also using these maritime drones to strike at tankers carrying Russian energy. In addition to that, and for years, the U.S. has been sabotaging Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure in Myanmar, in Pakistan. In Myanmar, it is a pipeline that is moving hydrocarbons across Myanmar to China. It's been attacked many times by U.S.-backed militants. So as you can see, the U.S. has already been setting up what is essentially a global maritime oil blockade on China. And if you look at their plans spanning many years, they always assumed that they would want to do it in the Malacca Strait and in the Asia-Pacific region, because if they did that, they would still be able to export energy from the Middle East to all of their proxies and keep their global network of proxies viable while only selectively strangling China. But that is not possible anymore because of China's military rise. People say, where's China's military? Why aren't they helping Iran? It's in the Asia-Pacific region. This is why the U.S. cannot strangle China in the Asia-Pacific region. And so they've decided, instead of doing that, and because of things that myself, you, and many others have been talking about in terms of the US military industrial base, its inability to produce the amount of munitions it requires for its global war against, I would say, multipolarism and ultimately China. They don't have the munitions to take out Iran, continue pressuring Russia, and also fight a large-scale war against China anywhere in the Asia-Pacific, proxy or directly. And so what I honestly believe that they have now done is attempt to solve two problems with one war, try to destabilize, topple Iran, and also create the conditions in the region that ultimately start choking exports from the Middle East and then close them off altogether. People, and this is the last thing I will say about this, people are saying that tankers are getting through, Iran is letting tankers go through to China. That may be true. But as we see, the US and Israel have struck energy production in Iran, because that is going to impact the energy Iran is able to export to China. There have been attacks on energy production in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia. All of these places are shutting down production. Qatar shut down all of its LNG production. That contributed to the exports going to China. So even if the ships can get through because Iran is letting them, what are they carrying if the production is down to zero or reduced to 50%? So this is already taking shape into a global oil blockade on China. And this is the one last area China was receiving these exports from, and the US is incrementally closing it down. And the way they're doing it is acting as if we had no plan, and this is spiraling out of control. And it just so happens that it's cutting China off slowly but surely, and we're bringing more assets into the region to keep the war going and make it worse and worse. Because if they openly said, we're going to impose a global maritime blockade on China under international law, it's an act of war, and they're trying to avoid that.